So we got this calculate investment results method in the app component, and we're expecting a data object here, which we then destructure to pull out the initial investment and so on. As a next step, we therefore must make sure that this gets invoked. And it should get invoked when this button here is pressed, this calculate button. The problem just is that this button, of course, is in a different component. It's in the user input component, not the app component. Now we could, of course, move this method into the user input component, but I actually want to keep it here in the app component because we'll soon add that results component that should output the table with the results, and I plan on inserting that results component in the app component template, which means we need to get access to the calculated results here in order to pass them into that to be added results component. So we'll need access to the results in the app component anyways soon, hence it makes sense to calculate them there. So I want to keep that method here. I don't want to move it into the user input component, and therefore we need to find another way of communicating from that user input component to the app component. And you did learn how you can communicate from a child component, which the user input component is, to the app component, to the parent component of that child component. So from the user input component to the app component in this case. You can communicate by emitting a custom event, and that's what we'll do here. So in the user input component TypeScript file, we can add a new property which we will turn into a custom event by using any name of our choice, though it should be a fitting event name, like for example, calculate. And now you got two different ways of making this a custom event, of making this an output, as it's called in Angular. You can either call the output function, which must be imported from Angular core, which can only be used if you're using Angular 17.3 or higher. Or you manually create an event emitter here, which also must be imported from Angular core, but which has been around forever and which is the approach you'll see in more Angular projects. Hence, I'll use that here. And you then also need to decorate this property here with @output. So with this output decorator like this, which also must be imported from Angular core. This decorator is only needed if you're using the event emitter here. If you're instead using the output function, you don't need the decorator and you shouldn't be using it then. Now it is considered a good practice to make it clear which kind of data will be emitted here, and you do that by adding angle brackets after event emitter before the parentheses, and then between those angle brackets you put the type definition of the type of data that will be emitted. And here I actually want to emit data that has this shape here. I want to emit an object that has these properties, which are all numbers. So we can copy this type definition here from the app component TypeScript file and insert it here between the angle brackets. Since this is a non-trivial type though, it's a bit longer, a bit more code, we could also consider putting this into a separate model though, a separate type definition which we could then reuse. And I'll do that soon, but for the moment I'll just copy and paste it to focus on outputting the event for now. So we got that calculate output. We can now use that here in onSubmit to call calculate, or this.calculate, since it's a property of the class, of course. This.calculate.emit. And you do that no matter if you manually created the event emitter or if you used the output function. Well, and then we have to emit an object of that shape. So an object that has all these properties: initial investment, duration, expected return, and annual investment. And the values now, of course, should be the values entered by the user, but transformed to a number. And you can easily and quickly transform a string value to a number in Angular by simply adding a plus in front of it. So plus this entered initial investment, for example, here for the initial investment property. For the duration, it's therefore plus this entered duration. For the expected return, it's plus this entered expected return. And for the annual investment, you guessed it, it's plus this entered annual investment. And with that, we'll emit this event, this output, and send this data, this object, along with it. Now, as a last step to finally trigger this calculate investment results function in the app component, we just have to listen to that emitted event. We can do that in the app component template by using event binding. And then here I get this smart suggestion, so by binding it to the calculate output event. Now we need to define which code should be executed when that event occurs. And here I want to call this calculate investment results method, or actually to be in line with how I always name these event handling methods, I'll name it on calculate investment results. This is not technically required, just a convention I adopted. So it's on calculate investment results, which should be executed here. Now I'm getting an error here because, of course, on calculate investment results expects one argument, but I'm not passing any data to it. And of course, I want to pass along that data which I emitted. You also learned how you can do that. You can use the special $event variable, which is made available by Angular when using event binding, to take that event data that was attached to the emitted custom event, to the output, and then use it in any way you want to use it. In this case, I'll send it as an argument to on calculate investment results. And now, as a last step to check whether this worked, I'll actually replace this return statement here, since currently there's no one who would be interested in returned data. I'll replace it by console logging this calculated annual data to see whether it looks all right or not. So that was a lot of work, but with that, if you save it all, if you reload and you enter some data here, like this, maybe, and you click calculate, you should see some annual data here, an array with multiple rows, multiple entries, one for every year. Since I have a duration of 10 years, I got 10 entries here. And then for every year, you see the annual investment, the interest gained in that year, the total amount invested, which is the initial investment, and the accumulated annual investments, the total interest gained up to this point, so the accumulated interest over all the years, and the value of the investment at the end of the year, which is the amount invested plus the interest. And that, of course, should update in a correct way for every year. So that's looking good to me here. And therefore, we got one way of calculating that annual data. The next step now, of course, is to output it on the screen before we then thereafter will explore how we could use a service instead of doing it here in the app component. But first, let's make sure that we output this annual data not just in the console, but instead on the screen in a table below the input. Now, actually, before I'll output the annual data here in a table on the screen, I'll do something else. I'll outsource this type definition here into a model, which is not something you have to do, but something that can make your code a bit leaner and easier to reuse. For that, I'll add a new file here in my app folder, and I'll name it investment-input.model.ts. The file name is up to you. But of course, it should describe what's inside of it, and it should follow this convention of having this description of which kind of thing you'll store in that file, if it's a component, a service, or in this case, a data model. Now, model is a big word here, though. In the end, in there, I want to create a custom object type with help of this interface keyword provided by TypeScript, which I'll name investment input to be in line with my file name here. And then I'll paste in that object type as we defined it earlier. Alternatively, instead of using an interface, you could have also used the type keyword to create this type, like this. It's up to you what you want to use. Here I'll go for the interface, since that's the approach you'll see a bit more often in Angular projects, in my experience. Now, we definitely need to export it. We also would need to do that with the custom type to make it available outside of this file, because the idea now is to import this custom type in all the places where such an object type is expected. So in the app component TypeScript file, I'll now replace this object type definition here by using my investment input type. And for that, we must import it. And we can add the type keyword in front of it to make it clear that this is just a type definition. And we then assign it as a type here for this data parameter. And it's now not just here where we can use it, but also in the user input component TypeScript file. There on this event emitter, it's now also this investment input type that we can use. And here we also must make sure that this import was added, and we can add this type addition here to the import. With that, of course, the program will still work as before, but we made our code a bit leaner. But now I want to make sure that the data is actually also output on the screen.